AP automation. And the very first webinar, this one, is focused on where do you start? Because one of the issues that many people seem to have is difficulty on deciding what are the options, what could they do, what should they do. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus on what are some of the goals of AP automation. We're going to look both from the perspective of senior management as well as from the perspective of accounts payable. We're going to talk about the kinds of automation that are available to you, the kinds of automation that other people are using, and we'll talk a little bit about how many people are using the various types of automation. We're going to talk a little bit about what you need to do, which is to assess where you are and why that's important. We'll talk about some of the barriers, the catalysts and drivers that either make you automate or help you to automate. And then we'll talk about some next steps. In terms of my own background, I've been involved with accounts payable automation for over 30 years, both from the perspective of building software to working with many accounts payable organizations to improve and enhance what they do, whether it's automation or just process improvement. But let's talk a little bit about some of those common goals. From the perspective of the CEO, the CFO, the president, senior management, over the 30 or more years, these goals have really been very much the same. The top goal for senior management for accounts payable has always been, please do it for less. Reduce the amount of money that you're spending on running your accounts payable department. Do it with fewer people. I've never been in an AP department that I thought was overstaffed, but there's always this pressure to reduce headcount even further. And the third goal, do it faster. From the amount of time it takes to get an invoice or an expense report processed and paid. What senior management oftentimes doesn't realize is the amount of time that it takes an invoice or an expense report to get to accounts payable is oftentimes much longer than the amount of time that it takes for an invoice to get through accounts payable. In fact, the ratio of 2 to through is oftentimes 8 or 10 to 1. It takes 8 or 10 times longer to get it to AP than it does to actually go through AP. And as I said, these goals have been in place for every survey that I've looked back at surveys done long before I got involved with AP. They're still the same things are being identified as being the top goals. More recently, I'd say within the last 10 years, these other 3 goals have begun to move in as well. One being, do a better job of implementing and using technology within accounts payable. More recently, although spend management is really a function of purchasing and procurement, it turns out that accounts payable has the data. So senior managers have begun to realize that, gee, AP needs to get involved in the spend management process. And lastly, regulatory compliance and policy compliance are some of the goals that we've seen as governments have started to enhance their revenue by having higher fines and penalties. So accounts payable really needs to focus on the laws and regulations. If we look from the perspective of accounts payable, it's rather interesting. These goals are really very consistent with senior management. And that's good. We've asked and we've seen surveys where it said, what is your top goal for accounts payable? And these first 3 items are the things that typically are answered as the top goal for accounts payable. Cutting costs, doing it faster, doing it more efficiently with fewer people. Some of the other things that appear as the top goal, and this is really a slightly different question, not the top goals, but the top goal. improving accuracy, improving the controls, doing a better job of policy compliance, cash flow, which is an important issue, customer service, and regulatory compliance. These do get reported, but not as often as the over 25% groups. Let's talk a little bit about the different kinds of automation that are available to accounts payable, and I'm going to briefly describe most of them. We've grouped them into 5 categories. First is invoice processing, front-end imaging, capturing an image of the invoice, if it's a paper invoice or an email attachment, up front, and then once you've got that image, having people work off of that image within AP and anywhere else within the organization needs to deal with invoice processing. Second area is just replacing the file cabinets. Well, if you do front-end imaging, you don't have to worry about back-end imaging, but back-end imaging is just simply getting rid of the file cabinets at the end of the process, imaging, whether it's invoices, expense reports, or other documents that come in accounts payable. This can eliminate 50% of the space within accounts payable. Well, those invoices that come in an unstructured form, whether it's a paper invoice or a PDF attachment, optical character recognition is a technology that can be used to replace the process of a human being reading, interpreting, and keying in the information. Electronic data interchange has been around for about 40 years, actually a little bit over 40 years. And this is a technology that can be used between a supplier and the customer, between accounts payable and the billing organization, to transmit data in a structured form electronically. It tends to be used in very high volume organizations because the cost of setting up a new supplier, a new customer, can be fairly high. Electronic invoicing is the more modern version of electronic data interchange. Comes in a lot of different flavors. A lot of people do things in very different ways. Web EDI is a mechanism that's used for those companies who have low volumes of transactions to take advantage of some of the capabilities of electronic data interchange, putting invoices into a structured format. Evaluated receipt settlement is not used that often, but it is used in the automobile industry and some other manufacturing organizations. Some people refer to this as invoiceless processing. What happens here is you issue a PO, and you have to issue a PO, and you get in a received document or a receive report. The items are received. You pay based on the number of items that are received based on the price on the purchase order. Requires very tight controls, not widely used, as we'll see on a subsequent slide. Negative assurance and assumed receipt is a variation on this. This is a case where there is no receiving document. We assume if we got an invoice and it was against the PO and there were no issues or problems, that the invoice is correct. Again, a technology that is available that can improve productivity but not very widely used. Another area that we'd like to look at in terms of accounts payable is the whole payment process. Purchasing cards, paying electronically via an automated clearinghouse in the case of T&E reporting and payment of employee reimbursement. Oftentimes this is done by a direct deposit. Maybe it's done by a payroll. Sending a remittance advice via email rather than sending postage. The last area is supplier-initiated ACH debits. Not very widely used, but can be very effective. For example, my own company, we get an electronic notification every month from our health insurance provider saying they have debited our bank account for the amount of our monthly fee. Now, our account doesn't change, or our billing doesn't change very much from month to month. It does change once a year, typically has gone up. But this is a very effective way of eliminating some transaction processing. But all of these require good controls. T&E, travel and expense processing, is an area that is typically only about 10%. Maybe at the high end it might be as much as 20% of the volume of invoices. However, T&E transactions can be fairly complex. They also tend to have much higher number of errors if they are not an automated system. Another area is improving the whole procure-to-pay process. Electronic catalogs, ordering items electronically. This doesn't just affect AP, it affects your entire organization. Having web portals to allow vendors to come in and submit an invoice, also potentially from a purchasing side to receive a purchase order, but also to get status inquiries. The last two categories, discount management, contracts, compliance, are two areas that have really not impacted a lot of AP organizations until the last few years. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to look at some of the surveys to see what people are doing. Lots of surveys being done. The first 5 organizations do annual surveys. Typically, most of them in the first quarter of each year, they do surveys. But there are a lot of other organizations that do them on a sporadic basis. One of the things that's key about surveys is, what do the questions really mean? Now, what we've done on this chart is we've taken all of those categories that we've talked about, all the various types of automation, and we've split them into the level of adoption. But you have to be very careful. I'm going to focus on just a few things. One is paying by ACH. Although at this point 85–90% of companies have the capability of paying by ACH. In fact, according to a recent article in the Wall Street Journal, 50% of all payments in the U.S. are still made with paper checks. But these two kinds of automation have fairly high adoption, paying by ACH and using purchasing cards. But you have to be careful when you look at some of these surveys to understand whether or not companies are reporting that they are capable of doing it or whether they are widely using it. The second category, of moderate levels of adoption, raises another issue. If you look at the last bullet of electronic invoicing, in some surveys they never define what they mean by electronic invoicing. In some cases, electronic invoicing may include getting an invoice as a PDF attachment to an email. In other cases, it means that I'm getting a structured transaction. That is, I'm getting EDI might be included in it, or maybe EDI is treated separately. In terms of the extremely low, I want to make a very important point about the very last item, which is contract compliance. This is a huge opportunity for accounts payable people. For many years, I co-founded and I ran accounts payable audit recovery business. And we began to focus on some contract compliance issues. And we found that there were huge amounts of mistakes and opportunities of recovering lots of money from vendors, not because of duplicate payments, but because invoices were not compliant with terms and conditions in the contract. So if your company doesn't have a contract management process, they should be considering one and make sure that as part of that process, they should be including contract compliance, because there are huge opportunities. 10 to 20 times as much money can typically be recovered in contract compliance audits than they can in duplicate payment audits. Okay, we talked about what are the options that are available. Give you a sense of what kinds of applications, what kinds of automation you could be doing and maybe you should be doing. Now what I want to do is talk a little bit about where you are. Because, as this quote says, it's very important to know where you are. Because not only will you never get to where you want to be, it's very unlikely that you'll get to where you need to be. So it's very important to understand where you are. And many people who've seen this in other presentations I've done said, you know, that's a pretty accurate representation of what our process looks like, or at least what it looks like to people outside of our department. If this is what your process looks like, you want to make sure that you can make some changes so that it can look cleaner and better. One of the next steps, once you've really understood your actual current process, and in fact, in the second webinar in this series, we will actually go through in more detail so that you can better understand what your process should be. But I do want to talk about why automation doesn't happen. And this is pretty important. The single biggest barrier to not getting automation in place is that somebody says, I need this, I want this. Well, that's great, but can you justify it? Can you identify why you should be doing this? Can you identify how you're going to do it? What it's going to take? What it's going to cost? So putting together a business case or a justification, it doesn't have to be a 40-page document. It can be fairly short, but it's very important to justify what it is that you want to do in terms of automation. Secondly is typically AP can't just go ahead and do something. They have to get funding. They have to get resources. So it's very critical to have a project sponsor, not just identified, but on board. You may not have the resources that you need. You may not have people, as I said earlier. No AP departments are overstaffed, but guess what? They're needed to do these projects. You may need some money, and you may need some technology. Unfortunately, most companies, information technology has AP at a very low priority in terms of automation, which is why to do a lot of this automation in AP, it makes a lot of sense to go outside and find a partner to work with that can provide the technology that requires minimal involvement, in many cases no involvement, of your internal information technology resources. Another barrier is it's going to take too long, or we don't even know how long it's going to take. Some cases it's, well, before I do this, I need to do that, but I need to do that before I do this, and so on and so forth. So instead of tackling things, you do nothing. And that is, unfortunately, a barrier that really can be easily overcome. Deciding what to do, obviously, we gave you a list of about 20 choices. And then the next question becomes of, well, okay, I want to do most of them, or 6 of them. What should I do first? Again, we will, in a second webinar, talk about some of the criteria you should use to figure out what to do first. Finding a solution that addresses requirements, there are lots of solutions out there, lots of opportunities. This one should be a no-brainer. In terms of selecting a solution provider, we think there are lots of answers out there, and of course one of the answers is to work with the sponsor of this webinar, Prudagio. The last 2 bullets are really very much the same. People are afraid of change. People are afraid of doing something that's not going to work. They're afraid that they might fail. So these are things that you can easily overcome these barriers as long as you say, we are willing to change. We talked about the barriers. Now let's talk about the things that help make automation happen. Probably the most significant one is senior management. It comes down and requests, we must do this. We've been hurt, we've been hit with some penalties, we've been concerned about maybe some fraud or We have to cut costs. We have to do it faster. We need to do these things. So senior manager says, we will do this. Laws and regulations. The technologies that are available, the world has changed dramatically in the last few years. The cost of technology has dropped dramatically. And there are lots of technologies that are well proven, well thought out, that can be drawn on to automate various parts of your accounts payable organization. The various parties that you deal with, these are people who probably call you up on the phone, what's the status of my invoice? When am I going to get paid? A vendor and such. Of course, your internal people, they know what works. They know what needs to be fixed. They have pretty good ideas. Listen to them and get some inputs from them. And also, some of the strategic suppliers to your company, they have, in many cases, been successful automating with other companies, other customers other than you. Talk to them and get their ideas and their inputs. Let's talk about what needs to happen next. You really need to make sure that you understand those approximately 20 options that we laid out earlier. And then you've got to filter. You've got to decide which are the best ones, which are the ones that are most appropriate for your company. What's best for somebody else may not even work, may not be needed in your organization. Something like ERS may be totally unnecessary, may be inappropriate. You need to understand the systems and people that you have in place. If you already have a financial accounting system or an enterprise resource planning, an ERP system, there may be some features and functionality in it. There may be some limitations that you can't easily do certain things within it. Similarly, you need to look at the people resources, the people within your department, the people who are going to be impacted by whatever solution you're going to pick. You want to make sure that you're going to be able to change, you're going to be flexible, you're not going to put both feet down and say it has to work this way. Be willing to accept and evaluate new ideas and new approaches. You want to make sure that you're setting your priorities, deciding what to do first. In the next webinar in this series, we're going to talk about some of the metrics that you can and should be using so that you can see how much progress, how much success, how much change you've actually accomplished by implementing these various projects. Make sure you use people and technology properly. Be willing to listen to and adopt new ideas. Be creative. And don't be afraid of taking risks, but take appropriate risks. That pretty much ends this session. But if you want to learn more about our sponsor, Prodagio, go to their website or call them. Speak with someone from Prodagio and find out what Prodagio can do for your organization. They also exhibit at many conferences. So if you're attending a conference and Prodagio is there, stop by their booth. They also speak at various conferences. So again, meet with them, speak with them. You've got a lot to learn, and they can be of some great assistance to you. Thanks very much for your time. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me or call Prodagio. Thank you.